Mental health is not a vertical, it's a horizontal. It's foundational to all the other impacts that we care about. Everybody loves to use the word collaboration, but nobody wants to do it because it becomes a possible spreading out of financial resources. So we see
Yeah.
the detriment instead of the benefit. One of the strange benefits of COVID is that it really put mental health on the map. We really are not going out and asking government to do this at this point. Governments are coming to us. Multiple state governments saying mental health is now a key component. We need to figure this out. We don't know what to do.
Welcome to Mind the Gap, a podcast about what's missing in global mental health.
I'm Christy Savetta.
I'm Chris Underhill.
And we're here to explore the stories, solutions, and systems shaping mental health around the world.
From community champions to global change makers.
Let's dive into what's working and what's not.
And what it'll take to close the gap.
Welcome to Mind the Gap, the podcast where we explore the funding and skills gaps holding back progress in global mental health and speak to people working close to them. Today we're joined by Steve Leventhal, CEO of WellBeing, formerly Cornerstone. WellBeing has been a pioneer in the prevention and promotion, working with governments and school systems to help young people build well-being, resilience, agency, and emotional skills before mental health challenges become crises. This is a slightly different conversation for us because we're not only talking about treatment, services, or the clinical mental health workforce. We're looking upstream at prevention, promotion, systems change, and what it really takes to work through government to reach young people at scale. Steve, you're most welcome.
Thank you, Chris. It's wonderful to be here.
Steve, thanks so much for joining us today. We're really excited to dive in. Before we get into WorldBeing and the systems work you're doing, I'd love to start with you. Where did this interest in psychology, well-being, and human development first come from? Where did it start for you?
Oh, I think you're going to regret that you asked that question because that goes back about 40 years or so, I guess, to date myself. When I was in college, I was very fortunate to meet a professor who ran the Asian Studies department. And I took my first kind of introduction to Oriental philosophy class when I was a freshman in college. So I was also studying psychology at the time, and that really put me on a path of the intersection, I guess you could say, between East and West, and also the intersection between psychology and spirituality. Again, just to date myself, if I went to a bookstore at that time and tried to find a section on that, intersection between East and West and psychology and philosophy, I think you could fit all maybe 20 books on one shelf in a bookstore. That, of course, has exploded, after that was really the origins of my own sort of personal journey. And I found a lot of, I guess you can say, psychology hidden within Buddhist thought, for example. There's a lot of psychological types of, especially in Tibetan Buddhism, there's quite a bit of history of that in terms of inquiries of the mind and the psyche and what the ego means and other kinds of things that we only labeled till, in the 1900s or late 1800s here in the West. So that was really the origins of my own, my own journey. And it took me a while, career-wise, to find a way to apply that. I certainly took a number of detours along the way. But I was very fortunate I think it was around 2006 or 2007, there was a local nonprofit where I lived in California, in Northern California, called the Center for Attitudinal Healing, which was founded by a very well-known American psychiatrist, Dr. Jerry Jampolsky, and also led by his wife, Diane Cirincione, both who is still a close friend. That organization was founded way back in the mid-1970s, and I think around 1975, and was really a pioneer in doing peer support work, using peer support circles as a way to bring people together. He also pioneered a lot of work around using circles for grief and loss, children dealing with life-threatening illness, and so on. And it was an approach that I would consider a psycho-spiritual approach, kind of basically bringing together both Western psychology types of concepts as well as basic spirituality types of approaches, and also a real strong belief in that people had the skills to solve their own problems. and an approach that was really grounded in what I would call universal principles around love and compassion, or let's call them universal values around love and compassion, gratitude, forgiveness, those kinds of things. Long story short, that organization found itself in kind of deep economic trouble and was looking basically for a new path. And the board reached out to me around 2006, 2007. And I joined in 2008 with the understanding that I would really bring that organization into a new direction, which included changing the name and the branding and so on and so forth, while also keeping the soul of that work, which remains the soul of our work today. So that's where we initially changed the name to Corestone, which was a name that was meant, honestly, as a kind of general name, to be completely transparent, that could mean a lot of things. I mean, the origins of the name were around a strong foundation for the heart. But that could mean mental health, that could mean other things. And at the time, in terms of the directions that I wanted to take it, in terms of applying a new sort of, I'm going to call it a toolkit approach that brought together positive psychology, for example, traditional spirituality, ancient wisdom, so on and so forth. We didn't know if we would be able to ever really talk about that using the language of mental health because nobody wanted to hear about it. Funders weren't interested in mental health. Governments certainly weren't interested in mental health. The internal joke is like, how many times did I break my nose because the door was slammed in my face? That has completely changed now, nearly 20 years later. But that's kind of the origins of the work. We felt that we really had landed on mental health and well-being, that the world was ready for us to message around that. And that's where the name WorldBeing came from, as in well-being for the world. And so that's kind of some of the origins of it.
That's fantastic. I didn't realize that it was started from the Center for Attitudinal Healing that you already mentioned. That's a really interesting kind of component to it. And the foundation around both those like East and West principles at the same time. I think it's interesting to understand that. Knowing what I know now about WorldBeing, understanding that it makes a lot of sense. It helps tie a lot of pathways together. And at some point, the work evolved from this element around peer circles and kind of supporting individual young people to asking a much bigger like systems question. How do we make well-being part of how children are supported at scale? What drove that shift in WorldBeing? And then I'll hand it over to Chris.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's maybe a few layers to that answer. The first was that when we first brought the work together, it's interesting to reflect on it now, because when I first brought the work together, I basically used, let's say, kind of basic principles of attitudinal healing. Let's say a grounding in certain values, like I mentioned, around love and compassion and so on. I wanted the work to be grounded in universal type of principles or values that could transcend differences in culture and make it, let's call it, relatively easy to bring the work from community to community. On top of that, we layered a lot of work from the field of positive psychology, which was founded by Dr. Martin Seligman in late 1990s, which really created a bit of a shift around not about what's wrong with us and how to fix it, but what's right about us and how to build on that. And I felt that the sector in general, again, now things have changed, but at least when I started, the sector in general was kind of overlooking the inherent strengths that are lying there, every day, latently within youth in particular in low-income communities. Again, the world is, this sector is taking a different approach, but at the time, I think that was a little bit revolutionary. So we still draw a lot from positive psychology. But one of the things that I learned over time was that even in the field of positive psychology, which now has become, very well known and has had a lot of wonderful widespread impacts, as I got more involved actually in the positive psychology community, like, academia and researchers around the world that do this work, I noticed that there was still a lot of focus on high-income country research, higher income communities, populations. And most importantly, I'm going to say a big focus on on individual psychological health, but not enough on like social psychology or community health. So one of the things I was really interested to look at early on was what could be the impacts of this work, not only on the individual and not only solely on mental health and individual well-being, but also on like shifts in attitudes, both individually and community-wise, around education, around gender equity, around certain health choices, health behaviors, and so on, reproductive sexual health, for example. So that's a long way of saying that there was basically a transition from focusing not only solely on the individual, but that individual's relationship to the community, and looking at this kind of work as really an empowerment model. That would have, sort of multiplier effects. So we did some early pilots in 2008, 2009, 2011, so on and so forth. Around 2012, 2013, I was introduced to a program officer for India at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation. And I had a meeting with him that really transformed us. And I honestly, from time to time, I still send him notes saying, thank you. You have no idea what you have let loose. I went into that meeting and I basically said, I need two things. I'd like you to fund a program for girls for 50,000 girls in India. And me, being from the US, thought that was a large number, 50,000. And I said, and the second thing I need is I want you to fund an RCT. And it's an RCT that's basically never been done. And that's true. This was the first of its kind. And we want the RCT to really look at what are the impacts of this kind of work, not only solely on the individual's, individual mental health, but also let's look at other domains around education and gender and reproductive sexual health and so on. And it was pretty much a bold move because the David and Lucille Packard Foundation was focused on one thing, reproductive and sexual health. They had no interest in mental health directly. So his response was kind of life-changing. He basically said, I will fund your RCT because I know it's going to work. Done. But I don't care about your 50,000 girls. We have 400 million. And I want you to come think about that and come back to me and tell me how you're going to deal with that. Wow. And that was my brain exploded. Now, obviously, we're never going to affect 400 million girls, but that was the genesis of really understanding that I really had to think about scale. And if we want to think about scale over long term, there's a difference between scaling as a parallel program, funded by funders, versus integration into whatever system you decide to integrate within. For us, that's the education system. It took us many years to figure that out. But the genesis of that really was that conversation.
Let me just jump in here. Thank you for that. I think, first of all, it would be helpful for our viewers and listeners if you just gave us some of your numbers now, because there is an important sense within well-being that volume does count. It's one of the, in our prep and because we know each other, I know that this is a very important feature of your work. So why don't you just share some of your top line numbers, just so we get a sense of where we're talking here?
Sure. Thank you. Numbers are important for us, but numbers with fidelity and quality, of course, is even more important. Yeah. Sure. I started our first pilot, basically it was me and a couple of volunteers, with 100 girls in 2009 in an 800-year-old Sufi enclave in Old Delhi. Fascinating community. Today, through 2025, we reached 4.2 million kids and trained, and I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's over 200,000 school teachers who facilitate the program.
And that's an important feature of your program, isn't it? The actual reaching of teachers.
Yes. And what's really interesting, to give a sense of the power of systems change versus scaling, because they're not the same. Through, I think, 2023, 24, we had reached a little over 1 million kids. Mm-hmm. And then in 25, we reached over 3 million, leading to a number of over 4.2 million. Mm-hmm. So And that's because we were able to transition into a true systems change approach of integration into the government. And what I mean by that, since you've brought up the school teachers, there's a couple of key components to that. One is, of course, advocating with the government or working with the government on policy.
Yeah.
The second is, of course, having a good program, the curriculum programming that can be adapted so that the government can integrate it into, depending on the government that we're working with, sometimes it's an integration into textbooks. It might be a separate handbook, might be an improved supplementary material. For example, that's what we have in Kenya. So that can take many forms. But a really, really critical piece is integration into teacher training systems. The teacher is, from my perspective, really the linchpin of all of it. Now, everybody says, yeah, but teachers are too busy. They don't have time. They're overworked. They're stressed, and so on and so forth. And that is 100% true. What we have found is the key to that is that teachers themselves have a personal experience of the work. So we do a very in-depth teacher training. And when they see the impacts on themselves and what the sort of promise and potential of this kind of work is, then they're very eager to do it with their kids. And they get immediate feedback. Things change in the classroom, behaviors change, and so on. So that becomes a positively, reinforcing mechanism.
Yeah.
From a systems change perspective, the key there is that we used to train school teachers by ourselves, and that can only go so far. Now we train up the teacher training institutes, pre-service, in-service teacher training within the government systems. And that has really been the key to the whole thing.
How easy has it been for you to make the journey? And I'm talking really about your own leadership here. How easy has it been for you to make the journey from conventional ideas of scale up on the one hand, and this very particular way of thinking about systems change, where you actually have identified systems of education of teachers, for example, and where you have actually gone in. And in a funny kind of way, you've been quite granular with a systems change. Do you see what I mean? So it looks as if you're working in a kind of service delivery sense, like a trainer, but at the other side, you're actually thereby, over time, increasing your volume incredibly through this whole question of system change, not being the same as scale up and so on. Could you unpick that a bit for us?
Yeah, Chris, it's a really interesting question and an insightful question. I think to give a sort of more well-rounded answer, the journey for us initially really, we recognized early, and I'm going back, 17, 18 years here, that we had a kind of I'm going to call it an obligation more than anything, to not only focus on building our own kind of programs, but there was just a lack of research and other practitioners doing this kind of work with any type of, coherent strategy and growth and so on in the whole ecosystem. So we really felt that we had and continue to have a real desire to help build the ecosystem. So for us initially, that meant really working quite quietly for quite a number of years. Many people did not know about us, building the research base. Mm-hmm. And so at this point, we've done over 20 assessments, maybe half a dozen RCTs, that have been published and so on. And that really laid the ground for us. So as a leader, I feel like I initially had to, it was talk about patient capital. And just going back to the Packard Foundation, they became an incredible partner with us in this journey. It was only in India and it was only in one state, but it was a very, very difficult state, very large state. The state of Bihar has a population of 120 million people. That's a third of the size of the United States, one of the two poorest states in the country. So it really gave us, that patient capital to think, and adjust our approach over time. And several years ago, they started saying, we really want you to be thinking about scale. And we looked at various scaling frameworks and sort of adapted those to our own needs. That was one transition, but certainly we were very fortunate to be introduced to Co-Impact a few years ago. And that they gave us a language around systems change that Initially, as a leader, I was kind of skeptical. I'm like, what am I going to learn here that we don't already know? And I was completely wrong. We learned a tremendous amount. And I think I'm very, very grateful for their support. It really helped us to shift our entire organization to a lens of systems change. And culturally, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
When you were talking to us in our preparation about that, and you were, very convinced of the effect of co-impact on the organization as a whole, you talked about a winning coalition. And that seems to me to be quite an important feature of what it was that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's a term from co-impact that I really like. Initially, we really had to work at building the ecosystem. I'm going to say that, and early on, we didn't really know what that meant. We weren't really good at that. We knew that there was a gap in research, and we needed to help address that as much as we could, and try to disseminate that as much as we could. But I don't think we really understood and took the time to really investigate and understand who do we need to influence? Who do we need to kind of let into the inner circle to influence us? Because it really is a multi-dimensional, multi-directional type of relationship. Mm-hmm. I think for a lot of organizations, I kind of miss that. And it's very difficult in the nonprofit sector, as we know. Everybody loves to use the word collaboration, but nobody wants to do it because it becomes a possible spreading out of financial resources, right? And so we see the detriment instead of the benefit. So the winning coalition really speaks to, if you really want to so we have a hugely ambitious goal in India to make well-being a guaranteed component of India's education system for all youth. Like, that's kind of an insanely ambitious, grandiose type of goal.
Yeah.
So if you're going to do that, one organization certainly is never going to do that. And so you really need to think from inception, what is that coalition? Who else needs to be there? And frankly, we're still putting that together. We're still trying to figure out exactly what that means.
Amazing. And so, borrowing some language a little bit from some of our funder counterparts in the space, when you're thinking about like your doers and your payers at scale, for instance, and in this example and in your work, would you say those are both government in the future in terms of how you're anticipating what it looks like in terms of that systems change?
We hope that we have and are successfully transitioning to a purely technical assistance partner. And so far, the indications of that are pretty good. One of the, sort of strange benefits, I guess, if you will, of COVID is that it really put mental health on the map. And whereas for the first, let's call it 10, 12 years, we had to knock on the door of the government. I'm going to use India in particular. We also work in Kenya and Rwanda, and we're having similar experiences there. But let me just use India because it's so large and it's further along. We really are not going out and asking government to do this at this point. Governments are coming to us. So we've had multiple state governments saying mental health is now a key component of what's called the new education policy in India. We need to figure this out. We don't know what to do. So that allows us to come in not as someone saying, hi, please give us permissions. Please write an MOU for us to run a parallel program or do a pilot or even just do a research project. It's an MOU that says we are providing assistance to the government and the government is responsible for X, Y, and Z. So, for example, we don't pay for printing costs. We don't pay for teacher training anymore. That's all being funded by the government. So that has been a phenomenal transition. So we're currently in 4 states in India. We will be expanding to at least 1, maybe 2 in 2026. So we'll be 5 to 6. Yeah. Wow.
And what a transition from the earlier days, 15, 20 years ago, when you were saying you can't even mention the word mental health. And now you're having governments knocking on your door saying, hey, we need this. And we're seeing this as a gap in an area. What a big change in the sector. And I'm curious as well. I mean, I kind of have to ask this. We talked a little bit about it in our prep. and I think it'll resonate with a lot of folks. Over the course of the last many years, we've seen quite a lot change within the mental health sector, within the global development sector, within the funding sector. And I'm curious, what's making you rage at the moment, Steve? What do you look at in the sector and think,
What's
actually,
making me rage? Oh.
this is frustrating? Like, where do you where do you see, like, we've seen mental health change, right? Maybe 15 years ago, the rage was no one's saying mental health. This is an issue. Let's knock down some doors. What is it now?
That's a great question. First of all, certainly the good news is there are many more donors interested in mental health. Absolutely. And that is a super positive. I just came back from the Skull conference in Oxford, as did the both of you. And to see the conversations around mental health and well-being happening and the amount of donors that were interested in that. We ourselves hosted a luncheon and, had a number of I'm going to call them new-ish organizations interested in this topic. Not all of them, but some of them new. And that's really very exciting to see. I'm not going to say this makes me rage, but it's a little bit kind of confusing. For 15, 16, 17 years, we've been talking about the fact that mental health is not yet one more vertical. The sector loves to have verticals, the SDGs and, health, equity, education, so on, economic livelihood, blah, blah, blah. Mental health is not a vertical. It's a horizontal, right? It's foundational to all the other impacts that we care about. And I've been on this bandwagon. We've been on this bandwagon for, 15 plus years. It's very exciting to finally see others, including funders, recognizing that. But clearly I'm a little frustrated by that as well.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a good and a bad. I would say the other piece, two other things are, it's great to see funders are coming to the table, but it is a moment of, I think, a lot of reflection and a lot of circling, trying to figure out really what is the best thing to do. I wouldn't say that's making me rage in any way. I think that that's understandable, but hey, we are in a bit of a mental health crisis here. We got to get to work. So the need, particularly for youth, is really, really urgent. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then my third one, I'm just going to say is, everyone loves to talk about systems change today. We're talking about mental health, we're talking about systems change, we're talking about sustainability. If you're going to play in that area, you got to make a 10-year commitment. Cool. The really frustrating piece, and we've had this happen to us more than once over the years, is when a funder comes in and funds basically a pilot and then says, well, the results weren't great. For example, we're going to move on. When we fund a pilot, it's a very, very thoughtful process, and it's an investment into a community, whatever community that is, or a system. We don't undertake pilots because we think, oh, we know everything. We undertake pilots because that's a learning experience, right? You do your pilot so you can learn, gather that data, and then put together something, with the inputs of the community and local youth and so on and so forth, so that you really do have something that's, can get to the next stage. So, when that happens, unfortunately, it's not frequently, but it does happen. That sets everything back. It sets back our own credibility in the communities and it sets back our own, expectations of what we're hoping for. So I think you got to make a long-term commitment. Otherwise, just don't get in the game.
I agree. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm hopeful that especially with the change in global development funding over the last year or two, where USG has kind of left the chat, if you will, in terms of the billions they used to be dropping in. I'm hopeful that we'll see maybe other funders stepping up to think about kind of systems change in a longer term perspective, a longer term approach. And I just want to reflect. I love that one liner, got to get to work. I've written that down as just a key takeaway here. You do just have to kind of get to work, stop circling, and let's make some things happen. I want to dig a little bit on this horizontal component of mental health. Mental health is akin to nutrition, to wash, things like that. It's akin to sanitation. It is a clear and important part of health in general, and it's not necessarily treated as much. And I'd love if you and Chris could reflect a little bit on, like, what is true integration of mental health? because we throw around the word integration and horizontal systems all the time. What does it actually mean in WorldBeing, and what does it actually mean in the sector? We're really thinking about mental health integration, and what are like the positive trends you're seeing in the sector around those two? So I'll turn that over to you two, because I think that'd be an interesting thing to talk through.
Chris, I've been talking a lot, so please share.
Yeah, well, I was struck the other day, Steve, when we were talking about the difference between vertical delivery and how historically, particularly mental health and mental illness has been treated in historical verticals, these very, very clear silos. And that's true of the way that the whole of the health system in many countries is actually designed as above anything else. And then the remark that you made, which I fully agree with, which is that in many ways mental health is a horizontal, quote unquote. In other words, it appears in our lives and in our individual lives in so many different ways, and is factored in into our lived experience, to use the modern phrase. And I just think it would be really interesting for us to tease that out a bit, and because it seems to me that it ties well within your understanding of systems change and the way that you've described it today.
Sure. I think the easiest, not easiest, sort of most obvious examples from our experience have been, because our work is really about integrating into the education system. So we want to look at, there's many aspects of how that can impact the system, as well as a student's experience in the system and a teacher's experience in the system. So, for example, we use tools like just schools assessments around school engagement, and we see that increases. There was an interesting study done by Columbia University taking our Youth First program and actually not employing our curriculum for students at all, only employing basically a modified teacher training that we offer, a 10-day training. I'm sorry, I think it's 10-hour training, 10-hour training for school teachers. And they did it in RCT in a particular area of India. And test scores went up something like 23%, 23% over controls. There was no program for children. It was simply that the teachers' sense of, engagement went up. The amount of time that they spent, for example, on grading homework went up something like 2 hours per week. I might have my stats a little bit off, so excuse me if I do, but roughly about 2 hours a week. So things where we are affecting the sort of sense of empowerment, resilience, agency, in particular, of a child and a teacher, go up. That has, lots of different effects. Mm-hmm. In our early RCTs, we saw changes around, attitudes towards reproductive and sexual health, for example, and behaviors. So I think, it's interesting. I'm going to go back to that original program officer from Packard that I mentioned at the beginning of this podcast. Several years later, I asked him, so why did you fund us? Mm-hmm. And I'm really interested. You fund reproductive sexual health. Why are you funding us? And he goes, oh, that's easy. You help kids make better choices. Mm. And, when you're in a sense of mental health and positive emotion and positive self-regard and so on and so forth, you are going to probably make better choices.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That brings me to the old adage that you and I have often bandied around, which is, of course, this word resilience. And in many ways, what you've been able to do, I think, is to sort of transcend from what you might call the everyday language of mental illness or mental health. And you've been able to bring young people, particularly children, into this world of resilience, which I think is very important.
Thank you, Chris. I think this is maybe a horrible generalization, but I think generally speaking, when we use the word mental health, people immediately go to mental illness.
Mm. Yeah.
And typically that is around anxiety and depression. I mean, these are all hugely important issues, and I'm not discounting that in any way. But mental health is not merely the absence of mental illness, right? It's really, and I think this is something that the field of positive psychology has done really a lot to popularize. What does it mean to live a flourishing life? It's not solely the lack of mental illness, right?
Yeah.
If you want to live a flourishing life, there's a lot of skill building around that, and self-insight and cultivation and understanding, it's particularly in the communities where we work, where you might be dealing not with hundreds, but thousands of years of discrimination, right? Let's use, the example of caste in India, for example. So if you're from a scheduled caste, or what we in the West call a low caste, and you're a girl and you're poor and so on and so forth, right? There's this ingrained self-identity. I call it like your psychological DNA, right? That's just ingrained there for hundreds or thousands of years. So we have to, from my perspective, start with how do we create some shifts just at that elemental level, and then build skills on top of that that really help a child to thrive. And we have so many fantastic examples of girls who were able to push back against early marriage, delay marriage, not just for themselves, but for others. Girls who had basically, no sense of a future outside of marriage or the family, who have gone on and completed high school, have gone to college, had careers, really, just really fantastic, very, very moving stories.
Yeah. I think that's a fantastic way to bring us to a close. I think we could dig into so many different components here, Steve, with you. But I just want to thank you for such an interesting conversation. I loved, that we started with the origins of the work as well. I think it's put a real strength behind what you've been able to share, and the core question at the heart of the work, which is, not what is wrong with young people, what is right about them. And it was fascinating to touch on, the systems change component, the integration component, even though we just skimmed the surface, but how this work moves from that individual well-being to kind of the community level shifts, which is really what you're talking about here. And then into education systems, teacher training, government ownership, all of that kind of work. I think we could spend hours talking to you. And one of the big takeaways here is, this work takes time. The space that you mentioned that you were able to take to research, to refine, to adapt, to think about your organization, the role and the services, the content you're providing, especially in a sector that always pushes people to move faster, even though they throw the brakes on a regular basis. Our greatest contradiction of our sector. But that space, I think, is so incredibly important. Systems change. It's not scaling quickly. It's taking the time to understand the system and build the winning coalition and really know what you're trying to change. So I appreciate your time to reflect on all of that and to share your lessons with us. And with that, as Steve says, as you say, we've got to get to work. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Christy.
Being able to dig into it.
Thank you so much. It's been great to be with both of you.
Indeed, Steve.
Thank you.